Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait a little bit longer to give people a chance to connect. All right, and while more people are connecting, let me just take the opportunity of welcoming you. My name is Matthias Lehmann. I direct the Center for Jewish Studies here at UCI, and I'm really pleased to see that so many people are joining us this afternoon for what promises to be a really, really interesting presentation and discussion. The event today is called Israel, Hamas, and the Gaza Complex. Gaza, of course, is in the news every once in a while, and so there certainly seems always a good reason to learn more about the complexities of the political issues surrounding the relationship between Israel, Gaza, and specifically the Hamas movement. We are particularly pleased, really, to be welcoming our speaker this afternoon, Alon Burstein, who is a recent PhD from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a political scientist who is teaching this year and next as a visiting professor and an Israel Institute fellow at UCI's Department for Political Science. He is a specialist in terrorism and political violence, and he has published articles in some of the most important relevant journals, such as Terrorism and Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Israel Studies, and International Interactions. It's really a privilege to be learning from Dr. Burstein this afternoon. And again, welcome to all of you. Before we start, I'd just like to thank our friend Mark Friedman of Irvine, who is generously sponsoring this and other events that we're hosting this quarter. So with and a little bit of housekeeping, this is important. Of course, we want to have a discussion, and we want to make sure that you have a chance to ask questions. So please, most of you will know the drill. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can do that at any moment, whenever a question occurs to you. Feel free to do that during the presentation, any moment after the presentation. Just put your question into the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, Alon, the floor is yours. Feel free to share your PowerPoint, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Matthias. It's great to be here. I'm going to share screen. And there we go. So, as Matthias said, the topic here is Israel, Hamas, and the Gaza complex. My email appears on the PowerPoint here. If anyone has any follow-up questions or would like to discuss this further, I never get tired of discussing this topic. Just to sort of give an introduction of what we are going to talk about here. As Matthias said, Gaza appears in the news all the time. I am not going to relate to the constant cycles of violence that are breaking out. Instead, the aim of this talk is to explain how we got to the current situation in Gaza. What is the history, the political history of the Gaza complex, and how we ended up in the situation with this repeated cycles of violence between Israel, Hamas, where the Palestinian Authority is, and etc. So starting us off with just situating where we are in the current situation. This is the Gaza Strip that we are currently talking about. It is an area of 365 square kilometers or 141 square miles, with a population of roughly 2 million. It is one of the most densest areas in the world, with an unemployment rate of about 48%. I put an asterisk on 48% because the figures are very hard to actually find. There's most of the work there is undocumented, things we'll talk about. The political status, and I emphasize the de facto political status. Gaza is controlled by the Hamas movement. We're going to talk about where the Hamas movement came from, how it got into control. It is under an air and sea and land blockade by Israel along the Israeli borders, air and sea, and land blockade by Egypt on the Rafah crossing. And again, what we're going to do in this talk is see how we ended up here. So, starting us off, jumping in. The origins of the Gaza Strip. Where did the Strip come from? The Gaza Strip was historically not a separate part of this territory. The territory of Palestine, the territory, the greater Arab territory in this region, Gaza was not a separate unit. In 1947, the UN puts forth the Resolution 181, the partition of Palestine, separating the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. And for the first time, the Strip starts to become its own separate unit. Following the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the war that breaks out with Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and other countries, the armistice lines in 1949 are drawn up, and the country of Israel looks like this, where the blue sections are the borders of Israel. This area belongs to Jordan, and the border with Egypt is this fairly straight line here, except for the enclave of the Gaza Strip that remains within Egyptian control. Unlike the West Bank that was annexed by Jordan, Egypt did not annex the Gaza Strip. It was left under Egyptian occupation. And the Gaza Strip really becomes sort of the backwater of the Egyptian state. Within the Gaza Strip, the population more than doubled as a result of refugees from the war. So before the war, there were roughly 60 to 80,000 Palestinians living in Gaza. This was added by 200,000 refugees. You have refugee camps that sprawl all across the Gaza Strip. And one of the things that you have is a major development of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that was founded in Egypt in 1928, which was meant to, through a grassroots social welfare, social activism, develop a form of political Islam in order to, from the ground up, work and into the people's hearts and minds. Starting in 1949, the Muslim Brotherhood invests heavily in the Gaza Strip, also because they are engaged in the conflict with Israel and see this as a very easy way to infiltrate people's hearts and minds. Also because in Egypt, there are several different crackdowns against the Muslim Brotherhood, and a lot of the activists flee to the Gaza Strip, and their Egyptian regime pretty much lets them carry on their activities. And this is a situation between 1949 and 1967 within the Gaza Strip, with a couple of cross-border insurgencies between Gaza and Israel. I'm skipping ahead through the more historical things until we get to current events. In 1967, war breaks out between, again, Israel and most of the neighboring Arab countries. And over 6 days, Israel's borders are transformed from looking like this to looking like this. Israel takes over the West Bank and the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and all of Sinai. Sinai is returned to Egypt within 10 years, or the process of returning to Egypt starts within 10 years. And by 1982, the borders are redrawn. And thus, these are the borders of the Israeli state, with the Egyptian border being here, and Gaza remaining not within Egypt, but rather within the Israeli territory. Under the Israeli rule, Gaza and the West Bank were not annexed to the country. Some parts, like East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, were officially annexed, and the people there given either citizenship or permanent residency. Gaza and the West Bank were not. Instead, the area was left under military occupation. Israel invested quite heavily in developing infrastructure, connecting Gaza to power lines, to water systems of the Israeli state. However, the people were not given citizenship. They were under martial law. And at the same time, Israel starts to develop a very, very intensive settlement project that is relocating Jews, Israeli citizens, from Israel to enclaves within the recent captured territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. While on the West Bank, settlements sprawl up across the region, vastly spread out. In the Gaza Strip, they are fairly concentrated along the coast of Gaza and in the north. And this is the current situation from the Israeli point of view, between 1967 and 1987. Meanwhile, the local population in Gaza undergoes several different political processes. First of all, they undergo what is called a very intensive process of Palestinization, whereas before the people may have perceived themselves possibly as part of Egypt, possibly as part of some future confederation. From this moment, the people are considered Palestinian. This process permeates into the Muslim Brotherhood activity that very much starts to talk in language of the Palestinian identity being very linked to Muslim identity and translating this into all kinds of grassroots political activity. At the same time, Israel was very effective in keeping out other Palestinian influence. Israel's great enemy at this time was the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which had no presence or no official presence in the territories held by Israel. The PLO was operating from Jordan, later from Lebanon, later from Tunisia, and any attempt of the PLO to infiltrate Palestinian politics was really kept out, sidelined by Israel. And instead, Israel had a policy of turning a blind eye towards the Muslim Brotherhood, because Israel preferred that the PLO be kept out, and instead that local politics be channeled into more social welfare, religious identity, Muslim Brotherhood activity. One of the things that you can see is influential in the Gaza Strip specifically that indicates how much the Muslim Brotherhood was being active at the time is the growth in the amount of mosques. This is just, I'm going to use very little figures in this talk, but one of the things to look at is between 1967 and 1989, the number of mosques in this small enclave of the Gaza Strip grows from 77 to 200 within this 20-year period under Israeli occupation, which indicates both how popular the Muslim Brotherhood was becoming, and at the same time, how much Israel was not hampering the activity of this organization. The Muslim Brotherhood begins to consolidate local politics. Its activists start permeating into universities and local municipalities, and at the same time offering massive programs of social welfare, free education, free food, and working alongside the Israeli authorities. In fact, in 1973, Ahmed Yassin, who was the founder and the head of the Muslim Brotherhood and the founder of Hamas later on, officially registers the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization called Al-Mujama al-Islami, within Israel's NGO registrar in order to offer social services in Gaza. So just summarizing this 20-year period in the Gaza Strip, we have an Israeli occupation, we have settlement projects alongside Israeli investments and very large process of modernization occurring in Gaza. And at the same time, we have a vast increase in Muslim Brotherhood activity. We have other Palestinian political leaders being sidelined. And we have all this going on at the same time as an active occupation. That becomes important for what happens next. At the end of 1987, the first intifada breaks out. Intifada means, literally it's translated as shaking off, but it could be also translated as an awakening. What it was a low-level or grassroots uprising of Palestinians across the Gaza Strip and the West Bank against Israeli occupation. The uprising breaks out in the Gaza Strip, in the Jabalia refugee camp, and very quickly, like wildfire, spreads across the Palestinian territories. The first intifada was marked by what we call low-intensity violence. It was not massive suicide attacks or armed assaults. There was very, very strong Israeli presence of the military in Palestinian towns, in refugee camps, and as a result, it was mostly low-level insurrections. It involved stone throwing, Molotov cocktails, tire burning, knifing, things that certainly cannot be considered peaceful, but they were met often with much harsher repression, which continued a very big and escalating cycle of violence. Right at the outburst of the First Intifada, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was not present in the territories at the time, very quickly tries to assume control. Very quickly, it activates people within the Palestinian territories to start guiding the uprising, to start making the uprising reflect Palestine Liberation Organization ideas, activities, demands, and to parlay this into a stronger political position. The Muslim Brotherhood also senses that the time has come. The time has come for the Muslim Brotherhood to rise up and become a leader within Palestinian politics. And very quickly, within about a month of the beginning of the Intifada, the Muslim Brotherhood starts establishing an organization that was called the Islamic Resistance Movement, which in Arabic is Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, or its acronym was Hamas. And that is how the group was formed. It began publishing communiques at the beginning of 1988 and was officially founded in August of 1988 with the explicit intent of challenging the PLO's framing and portrayal of Palestinian politics and of the Intifada. While the PLO was very much pushing a nationalistic agenda, framing the Intifada as an attempt to shrug off a colonial entity and the right of self-determination of the Palestinians, Hamas rises up and challenges this framing the Intifada very specifically as a religious conflict. It is a religious conflict between Muslims that are under occupation, trying to liberate Islamic land from the Jews that have taken it over. I just bring as one illustration, Article 12 of the Hamas Covenant, which was published in August of 1988, explicitly states, nationalism from the point of view of the Islamic resistance movement is part of religious creed. And then later on, because Palestine is an Islamic waqf, we are determined to liberate it no matter what, to the death. This was the continuous challenge of Hamas against the PLO. As the Intifada goes on, and due to a lot of other geopolitical shifts, which I'm not going to get into at the beginning of the 1990s, Israel starts to realize that it is not going to manage to hold on to the territories in the same way that it has held on. For 5 years, local population is continuously challenging the PLO's activity. Local population is continuously challenging Israel's regime. The PLO is gaining a lot of strength within international politics. And Israel, starting in 1991, more openly in 1992, starts a process of negotiating with the PLO in order to reach some sort of settlement in which Israel will withdraw from territories and the PLO will take control. This leads to a series of negotiations that are known as the Oslo negotiations that began in 1993 and continued in 1993, 94, and continued for 5 to 6 years. There are many, many facets of these negotiations. I'm only going to get into a couple of the brief ones that are important also to understand Hamas, and also in order to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as it is continuing today, because a lot of the facets and problems that exist are a result of these agreements. So beginning in 1993, a famous handshake between Arafat and Rabin, where both sides agree that they are going to stop the war between each other and come to a peaceful agreement. In 1994, one of the first agreements that was known as the Cairo Agreement, or known as Gaza and Jericho First, was the first time that Israel accepted that it would withdraw from territory, and in turn, the PLO, any Palestinian representative, would take official security control of the area. The term Gaza and Jericho First was, as its name implies, that was the parameters of the deal. Israel would withdraw from Palestinian towns, would withdraw from main urban areas of Palestinians in Gaza and the city of Jericho, hand it over to the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the PLO would assume civil administration, it would assume policing, and would work in cooperation with Israel in order to continuously take more and more control of different regions. In 1995, the second major agreement is signed, sometimes known as Oslo B, the official name, the interim agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in which the Palestinian Authority is officially established, and the Palestinian territories are divided into areas A, B, and C. I bring this up mostly because that division in the West Bank between areas A, B, and C still exists today based on these negotiations and is part of the very, very complicated situation of the West Bank. However, if we focus on Gaza, the parameters of the agreement were that area A would be in areas that would be completely handed over to the Palestinian Authority. Israel would withdraw all of its military to the surrounding areas, and everything, including security, including enforcement, including administration, would be handed over to Palestinians. Area B would be an area in which there would be joint policing and activities, and area C is the area in which Israel maintained its settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, would be full Israeli control. What is important to note about the map is starting from the beginning, Gaza was predominantly area A. It was predominantly handed over to the Palestinians, and that is one of the reasons that a lot of Palestinian local activity, like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, was able to flourish in this area. Alongside these negotiations, extremists from both sides reacted very harshly. Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad saw any negotiations with Israel as a betrayal, a religious betrayal and a nationalist betrayal of both Islam and the Palestinian nation, and they start a massive campaign of suicide attacks in Israel in order to circumvent the deal. In turn, on the Israeli side, there are also extremist response. Baruch Goldstein carries out a massacre in an area in Hebron, and Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by a Jewish extremist. I'm skipping through the Oslo Accords, even though, again, books have been written about them. Suffice to say that at the end of 2000, so in October 2000 to be precise, the negotiations between Israel and the PLO collapse. The interim agreement set out in 1995 that there would be a final agreement within 5 years. There was an attempt to reach that final agreement. A lot can be said on why it collapsed, but suffice to say, the negotiations collapse. They break down. And at that moment, in September of 2000, no one really knows what direction things are going to take. But for our purposes in the Gaza Strip, what is happening at that moment is the overwhelming majority of the Strip is under Palestinian Authority control. Israel has very little presence inside the Strip itself, except in the settlements and in the areas surrounding, which are very tightly fenced off. And this is very different than the situation in the West Bank, which will become important later. Moving on, and I recognize that we are going through a lot of history, and I hope everyone will forgive me. At the end of 2000, specifically in September, October, the second Intifada breaks out. The second Intifada was very different in nature than the first Intifada. While the first Intifada was characterized primarily, as we said, from more grassroots activity and more sabotage and a lot of violence that did result in casualties and deaths, but was more primarily by Palestinians in the Palestinian territories against soldiers in that area. In the second Intifada, massive campaigns of violence are launched from Palestinian territories, carrying out overwhelming amounts of terror attacks inside the borders of Israel. This includes 144 suicide attacks that were carried out by Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, alongside the Tanzim, Fatah, all aspects of the PLO. And at the same time, Israeli retaliations were not limited to trying to simply arrest those who were carrying out violence. There were massive military retaliations that included targeted assassinations, included bombing areas from which violence was launched. The nature of the second Intifada was a lot more what is considered armed assaults on both sides. In 2002, Israel, following a series of suicide attacks, Israel launches Operation Defensive Shield. That operation, which is these tanks in this picture here, with overwhelming force, Israel retakes Palestinian towns in the West Bank, those towns that it withdrew from during the Oslo agreements, retakes those towns, leaving a lot of decimation, dismantling and arresting thousands of Hamas cells and Tanzim cells, and really breaking down the infrastructure of these groups in the West Bank. Critically, Operation Defensive Shield did not take place in Gaza. So while Israel decimated the Hamas infrastructure in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, Israel did not invade, primarily because the Gaza Strip is much more surrounded by Israeli forces, and it's easy to contain the violence inside the strip. So it was not seen as necessary. The second major event that happens, which some attribute to the end of the Second Intifada, is in 2005, the disengagement plan, following the Second Intifada and Israel's recognition that it cannot maintain 8,500 settlers living inside an enclave of 2 million Palestinians with constant daily terror attacks. Israel carries out a complete evacuation of the Gaza Strip, maintaining its forces around the Strip, pulling out all settlers and all military presence inside the Gaza Strip. This was done in coordination with the PLO, in which it was decided how the borders would be run. The PLO, alongside UN forces, would monitor anything coming into the Gaza Strip. They would make sure there was not weapon smuggling and a lot of very, very complicated deals. However, despite the best laid plans, in January 2006, there are elections in the Palestine National Council, and much to many people's surprise, Hamas wins a pretty decisive victory. While it won 44% of the vote due to the voting system and regional elections, it managed to gain 74 seats in the parliament compared to Fatah, the PLO's secular branch, which had attained 45 seats. And at this moment, the entire political system is changing, as Israel has made deals with the PLO on maintaining security within Gaza, and all of a sudden Hamas, who is not a part of these deals ever, takes control of the government. The PLO assures Israel that it will still maintain its presence in the borders and make sure that Gaza does not rearm itself so that it can launch attacks against Israel. And going to what I call from bad to worse in looking at the Gaza Strip. In June of 2007, so a year and a half after Hamas's victory, Hamas carries out an internal coup, one might say, in the Gaza Strip. Its people storm the different PLO and Fatah institutions and security establishments, executing hundreds of people. And within 5 days, the PLO is effectively completely kicked out of the Gaza Strip. Hamas maintains sole presence over the borders. It maintains sole presence over policing, over all the arms that the police had in the Gaza Strip. And this produces two things. First, the Palestinian Authority president, Mahmoud Abbas, disbands the Hamas government. And effectively, from that moment, there is a split between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Whereas before, they were both seen, despite their geographical split, as one political entity. From that moment, there are effectively two different Palestinian actors. Whereas in the West Bank, there is the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas as the chairman of the PLO. Gaza is completely controlled by Hamas with no legal recourse, but de facto on the ground. At that same time, in June of 2007, Israel, in coordination with Egypt, begins a massive blockade of the Gaza Strip in response to the fact that now Hamas controls the borders and controls the region and can use anything coming in order to manufacture weapons, develop terror infrastructure, et cetera, Israel begins what was at first a complete suffocation of the Gaza Strip, but within 2 years, due to a lot of different political changes and pressures, the siege is very much eased, however, is still in effect. Starting in 2009, there are hundreds of UN supply, humanitarian aid, assistance coming into Gaza through Israel. However, only things that Israel maintains is allowed. And this is part of the ongoing blockade that is occurring. At the same time, Israel maintains control of all seaports, and there are no active seaports in the Gaza Strip. All air traffic control, there has not been an effective airport in Gaza since 2002. And all land crossings are controlled by both Israel and Egypt and are effectively shut down. People can leave Gaza or come into Gaza only with special permits. This happens very rarely. And this is the current situation since then. The military clashes that are the ones that make it to the news have been occurring consistently since 2007, more predominantly since 2009, in two main ways. One are Hamas building up a vast array of rockets of different sizes and shapes. They're called Qassams. They're called all kinds of different things. We can talk about that during the Q&A. These are launched from Gaza fairly regularly against bordering neighboring Israeli towns and usually are met with some retaliations. The major flare-ups that make international news are the ones that are commonly a result of spirals out of control. If Hamas launches one of these rockets and it also manages to cause extra damage, or is a political time where it's more convenient to retaliate, sometimes the war will spiral out of control. Sometimes there are simply facts on the ground that lead to these spirals, such as happened in May of this year. Israel has developed the Iron Dome, which again, everyone knows about. Some of these pictures here are from the recent engagement in May of this year. And these, the list that I put here, are only the main ones. There are flare-ups that happen. There's an entire list I was picking and choosing every year. There are different flare-ups that occur and Israeli responses that leave vast destruction in the Gaza Strip, as can be seen just in one example. And most of this cannot be rebuilt primarily because of two factors: the blockade that Israel and Egypt are imposing, and at the same time, Hamas's utilization of most of the humanitarian aid that comes in towards building up more armaments, building attack tunnels, building all kinds of things, again, that have made their ways into the news. There are lots of other different types of violent incursions. These include storming of defenses. These include every now and then when, as a result of an attempted infiltration, Israel will invade parts of Gaza and withdraw. But this push and pull, going back and forth, has been fairly steady since the blockade began, since Hamas took over in 2007. So, bringing us back to how we got here today. In the Gaza Strip, there are a little over 2 million people. It is one of the densest areas. Unemployment has skyrocketed beyond any measurable account, primarily because of continued destruction of infrastructure, continued mismanagement, a continued blockade, and a continued inability of anything from the West Bank, including human resources or material resources, to easily get to the Gaza Strip. At the same time, Hamas has refused to recognize Israel's right to exist, has refused to engage in any negotiations with the Israeli state directly. All negotiations occur indirectly. And as a result, this is a continuous stalemate that has existed since 2007. You can even say probably since long before, that is continuing till today with continuous spirals and flare-ups. On that note, I am going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm happy to take any questions or to discuss anything further.
Thank you so very much, Alon, for giving us this this survey of what is sort of a complicated and ongoing drama. So the floor is open for questions. As you know, you can put your questions in the using the Q&A function. And let me just read the first question that we received. So some countries distinguish between Hamas's political wing and its military wing for the purposes of prescribing the group on terror lists. Is that, in your view, a relevant distinction?
It's a good question. Hamas was initially set up as the military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. That was its initial characterization. It very quickly took over the Muslim Brotherhood and there was nothing else left. And then in 1991, its military wing, what's called Ezzadin al-Qassam, was established in order to separate the political activities from the military activities. This distinction is more relevant for other types of organizations, possibly like Hezbollah in Lebanon, where organizations have an active role in politics and at the same time also carry out a lot of military activity. With Hamas, that distinction is largely artificial. Because Hamas does not, there is no other government in Gaza that Hamas participates in politically, other than its own institutions, the distinction between a military wing that serves to enforce the police, to enforce military and or terrorism, and the political establishment is largely artificial in that case. That is not to say that comparatively these distinctions should never happen. In Hamas's case, I would say that distinction largely does not matter.
All right, thank you. So the next question, how are missiles and larger weapon systems actually smuggled into the Gaza Strip, considering that, you know, this blockade has been imposed for so many years already?
So that is a question that keeps on surprising a lot of Israelis and a lot of people throughout the world. Starting in 2007, Hamas invested a hell of a lot of resources into developing a very, very established tunnel system, smuggle system between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. The Egyptian side of the Gaza Strip, the Egyptian border, is the Sinai Peninsula. As a result of peace treaties between Israel and Egypt, Egypt is not allowed to bring in large contingents of forces near the border. Egypt has repeatedly asked Israel to allow it to violate the agreement and bring in more military presence to the border so they can stop these smuggling activities, and Israel has largely refused. And so there are large networks of smugglers that are operating along the border in order to smuggle materials and weapons in. At the same time, Hamas has also developed a very, very intelligent infrastructure in converting a lot of humanitarian equipment into missiles and into weapons and armaments. But primarily, this is done through these smuggling tunnels. That ability has largely been curtailed by Egypt. Egypt undertook a massive project of building an underground barrier in order to stop these smuggles. But at the same time, nothing can be done in a complete way. But the combination of those two things is what is continuously allowing Hamas to develop this armaments. That and a lot of smuggles through humanitarian aid that are largely facilitated, I should say, by Iran. Iran invests a hell of a lot of resources in trying to smuggle into the Gaza Strip more and more weapons as part of its strategy to, if the day should come and Iran is attacked, that with one snapping of a finger, they can light up the Middle East by activating Hezbollah, Hamas, groups in Yemen, etc.
Thank you. And you know, the chat is filling up quickly, so but you know, we'll do our best to get to as many questions as
I never get tired
possible.
of this topic.
So this question is about really the relationship between, let's say, the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank in Gaza. How would you characterize, you know, that relationship? What kind of relationship would you, what maybe the population, as far as we can tell, and the leadership of the Palestinians in the West Bank would like to see with Gaza?
So it is really two different questions. One is the relationship between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, as Hamas is trying to increase its activities in the West Bank. And then there's the relationship with the Gaza Strip in general. When Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, Israel began negotiations with the PLO, offering to go in and retake the Gaza Strip and hand it back to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority largely refused because they recognized that this would be the final nail in the coffin for them to be seen as simply Israeli collaborators, as simply the executioners of Israeli policy. There have been several different attempts to end the deadlock between Hamas and the PLO, or Gaza and the West Bank. There have been attempts to continuously develop a unity government that will reflect both the Hamas movement and the Palestine Liberation Organization. These attempts are continuously dragged out and every time are destined to failure. The last one was in May, and some say may have been one of the catalysts for Hamas to retaliate to the violence that was going on in Jerusalem, whereby there was an agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority that there would be general elections held in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip over a 2-month period for both the Palestine National Council, so for the parliament, as well as for the presidency. It was suspected that the PLO, i.e. the president of the Palestinian Authority, never intended to carry out these elections, and the elections were canceled 2 weeks before they were supposed to happen because of a lot of excuses. So right now that there is continuous negotiations, but the deadlock is nowhere near being solved. In terms of the population, it is very hard to know. There are continuous surveys that come out by different Palestinian bodies that try to show what do the population in the West Bank think about Gaza, what the population in Gaza think about the West Bank. But one thing that's important to remember is that the Palestinian population in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip are very different culturally and historically. The West Bank was historically linked much more to Jordan. The citizens there were annexed to Jordan during the brief period of 49 to 67. And there are actually under the Palestinian Authority, there were 2 different judicial systems for the Gaza Strip and the West Bank because these populations are very different culturally and historically. So politically, they may see themselves as one entity, but in practice, there is now de facto 2 different entities that may one day come together, but it's honestly hard to see how.
Thank you. Here's another interesting question. To what extent is there agreement among experts about the facts that you presented? Are there other historical narratives that differ from the account that you gave today?
I welcome the question.
Not an easy question.
Not an easy question to answer, to be sure. I'm trying to think how I can answer this. I would say that different historical accounts would certainly emphasize radically different things along this narrative. I think that there is little disagreement about the facts in terms of who controlled what when, what happened at different times, what were the macro reasons for those things happening. However, someone else giving this talk may have emphasized entirely different elements. Someone may have not emphasized the vast growth of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gaza Strip, and may have emphasized the harshness of Israeli occupation between 1967 and 1987 in order to then say, and in response to this, Hamas is created. May have equally emphasized from a different side, not mentioned the negotiations between Israel and the PLO and Israeli withdrawal from towns, and may have simply said Israel tried to make peace, the Palestinians walked away from that, and then the Second Intifada was launched. So I hope that there would be little disagreement on the different facts, but the emphases that are placed, and through emphases, obviously, you get a certain framing and narrative of what is happening and why, I think could be done very differently. So, for example, just if we go to the last thing that I mentioned about the rounds of missiles and rockets, it is equally possible to mention the overwhelming devastation that is occurring in the Gaza Strip, the poverty levels that are some of the worst in the world, the thousands of Palestinians dead as a result of Israeli operations, and then to mention, in response, Hamas sends missiles here and there. So you can frame things very differently. I don't think there would be a lot of disagreement on the facts as they developed. At least I hope not.
Okay, thank you. And speaking of narratives, so the next question, could you please discuss the ways in which the media frames Gaza, especially in the United States and in Western Europe, and how this portrayal relates to the historical narrative that you have outlined?
I think the media is too vast a term. There's obviously different media outlets, and there is an overwhelming difference between what is considered established media and social media or infotainment or things like that. Largely speaking, the Gaza Strip is, to put it bluntly, a thorn in everyone's side. It's a thorn in the United Nations side that has invested billions upon billions of dollars in rebuilding the Gaza Strip over and over, in UNRWA, the UN mission, ostensibly to the entire Palestinian population, but most specifically to the Gaza Strip. And because the infrastructures are constantly being rebuilt and then destroyed primarily by Israeli attacks, because Hamas is using a lot of this infrastructure to build up weaponry, the United Nations, and as a result, a lot of the media, tends to emphasize that devastation, tends to emphasize that loss. At the same time, throughout most of the world, the stronger party, I mean, we don't tend to look at this, but throughout most of the world, the stronger party tends to be looked at, why did you do X? So when Russia goes to war with Ukraine and annexes part of it, most of the world often does tend to suggest, why did Russia do this? The Ukraine couldn't possibly defend itself. Why did Russia do this? In the Israeli case, there are a lot of reasons to place the onus of responsibility on Israel. Israel decides largely when enough is enough. Hamas sends missiles onto Israeli towns, and that unto itself obviously is not something that should be taken lightly. But Hamas nonetheless sends missiles onto Israeli towns, and every now and then Israel will say enough is enough and retaliate. The media is going to report on the retaliation. They're going to report on the way Israel is reacting. Hamas and the Palestinian movement in general have been overwhelmingly effective and victorious in presenting their narrative to the world. Now, again, much like the previous question of would someone else look at this differently? A lot of people attribute this to a bias of the world against Israel or to anti-Semitism, and certainly that can be attributable. A lot of people attribute this to a continuous failure on the Israeli part to actually put forth its own narrative. But I think the media tends to focus, as medias tend to do, on what is the hot button story. Unfortunately, in the world, hot button stories are when there is violence. And as a result, what the media focuses on is the devastation that occurs in Gaza rather than the violence that does put a lot of Israelis in the hospital and in trauma, but does not create as much of a media buzz. As one final example to this question, I will remind people of when the Taliban took over Afghanistan. The media all over the world, nothing except the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan was being reported on. There was violence, there were suicide attacks, that is what was being reported on. Those of us who study terrorism were watching the Taliban slowly take over for 3-4 months. Those of us who follow terrorism since then are looking at the Taliban continuously carrying out massive repressive actions against the Afghan people. That's no longer in the media. The media cares when there is outbursts of violence. And as a result, the outbursts of violence that get reported are ultimately they ultimately show Israel to be the aggressor side because it levels much larger scales of violence and retaliation. And thus that tends to color the way people see this.
All right, on to the next question. We won't give you any rest. So is it conceivable that Hamas's origins as a more religious and service organization, which, as you say, Israel at one time had registered in some form as an NGO, could eventually bring it to more political engagement and readiness to compromise than the Fatah-adjacent organizations in the West Bank? I have in mind something like Ra'am and its more moderate southern wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. And maybe just to add this question, which sort of points in a similar direction, are there any moderate or pragmatic elements within Hamas that want direct negotiations with Israel with a view to agreeing some form of peace deal?
So if I understood the first question correctly, it was, is it possible that because Hamas has a vast emphasis on religious and sort of social welfare ideals, could this maybe bring it to a more pragmatic stance because nationalism is not its strongest position? And then are there more moderate voices within Hamas? If I understood, I hope I understood the question correctly. Hamas, like a lot of religiously motivated terror groups, is not inclined to negotiate. It's not inclined to see the enemy as one that you can negotiate with, and it is somewhat, because of its religious stance, it is somewhat bound by its precedent. If Hamas states, as they do in their covenant and repeatedly by their religious scholars, that it is religiously not allowed to negotiate with Israel, and it is heresy to compromise with Israel, Hamas is largely bound by this because of its religious nature. It's very different than a nationalist group that can say, we recognize we're not going to achieve this. And we were wrong before to say we will never negotiate. See this in the case of the IRA, the PLO. A lot of nationalist secular groups are capable of saying, you know, enough, we tried. Religious groups have a much harder time doing that. They cannot maintain their position. They cannot ever agree to lay down arms and still say, but we are following our initial religious decree. That is one of the reasons that when Hamas, and this addresses the second question, when Hamas has recognized over the years that they need to break this deadlock, they need international recognition, they need resources, they need food. When they have recognized this, they have tried to find all kinds of ways to possibly reframe some of their ideology while still maintaining very, very adamantly, but we are not abandoning our previous line. The biggest example of this is in 2017, when Hamas put out a new policy platform. They put out a new policy platform in which they said things that they had never said before officially. Things like, there is recognition that as a first step towards liberating Palestine, Hamas will accept the 1967 borders. There is recognition of that. There is recognition that Hamas is fighting the Jewish political manifestation of Israel, but not fighting Judaism and not fighting against the Jews, which is very different than the Hamas covenant of 1988, which is riddled with anti-Semitism, which attributes to the Jewish plot, World War I, World War II, the Freemasons, every possible thing under the sun. So Hamas puts out this new policy platform. However, it is important to emphasize, when Khaled Mashal, at the time the leader of Hamas, introduces the policy platform, he opens by saying, this policy platform does not supersede the initial covenant. Any contradiction that you see between it and the initial covenant should not be seen as a contradiction, and the covenant will always supersede it. So the group really has a problem. I say, honestly, they wish they could sometimes deviate from their initial ideas, but the group really has a problem to do that. There are more moderate forces that suggest that the group should undergo a process of possibly what I call secularization, that is to say, start to reframe the conflict much more nationalistically, and therefore not be bound to the previous traditions. It's yet to happen. I think that Israel's, and to some extent Egypt's, great hope is that through the blockade, Hamas will eventually recognize that it has no choice so far, it has shown quite a lot of resilience, and no matter how much it suffers, it will persist. So if I understood the question properly, I hope I answered it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the blockade, which maybe leads us back also to the question of the economy. So there are a couple of questions about that. So you mentioned, right, 48% unemployment in Gaza. Can you say more about the Gazan economy and or how people's basic needs are satisfied or not satisfied? And maybe there was another question about the economy that now I don't find. But really, to what extent, the economic situation really is sort of maybe the driving force of a lot of the political dynamics that you've been describing.
So it's completely correct. I did not discuss the economy a lot. The economy in Gaza has largely been decimated as a result of the Hamas takeover and Israel's responses, Egypt's responses, and the responses of the Palestinian Authority. Those three actors came together, each in their own way, to suffocate the Gazan economy because they equate the Gazan economy with Hamas's economy, which largely can be seen as a fair equation. Hamas has taken over the bank systems. They have taken over the infrastructure, imports and exports. And while those different entities see that equation, they've come together to suffocate this in order to, again, in hopes of possibly convincing Hamas to either relinquish territory, relinquish its control, change its ideology, etc. The economy in Gaza relies largely on international investments. It relies largely on humanitarian aid that is channeled through the United Nations and through lots of different organizations and actors. I'm trying to think how to put this simply. The wages of most employees in Gaza are paid in roundabout ways through the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority has said that it will continue to pay the wages of bureaucrats in Gaza because they want to show that they work for them. However, because the banking system in Gaza is controlled by Hamas, this commonly is just not done. People are not getting their wages. People are not able to build themselves up. People's basic needs largely are met through smuggling into the Gaza Strip, through very, very small exports, and through massive humanitarian projects that are undergone by the UN, by the EU, some channeled through Israel, all with Israel's approval. Just as an example of the way these countries are trying to suffocate the economy, Israel in the last 2 years started to make deals with Qatar, that Qatar would fund some of the bureaucratic administration in Gaza because Israel does not want that administration to collapse. It wants to avoid a humanitarian disaster. However, if anyone saw images of suitcases of money being brought into Gaza, the reason that those things are being brought by suitcases through Israel is because Israel is bound by its own law to stop that money if it goes through the banking system. If money is given to Hamas-run banks, Israel is required to seize it. And so Israel made a deal with Qatar that it would allow the money to be brought in by suitcases and turn a blind eye because Israel puts a freeze on the banking system. So it is a very, very complicated economic situation. But again, the unemployment there is skyrocketing. And what you mostly have is younger generations that are growing up with nothing to do, growing up with very little education. And those who manage to get an education are still not finding employment. And as a result, these people tend to turn towards Hamas to say, okay, let me work in building tunnels. Let me work in the smuggling business. Let me do something. So that is largely one of the ways that Hamas manages to maintain a lot of loyalty, even though it is also largely responsible for the current situation.
All right, thank you. And thankfully, in your answer, you already, I think, covered, some of the other things that people have been, asking in the chat. With this question, let's move sort of into sort of the broader regional politics of this. So Hamas seems to get military support from Iran in recent years. The weapon systems obviously has advanced quickly. So what are the ways to deter or stop this development? Do the recent Abraham Accords make any difference?
The Abraham Accords were signed with countries that largely Israel already had relations with. So even though those relationships were not normalized, they were not open, there was already vast cooperation economically between Israel and the respective countries, and also largely on intelligence, because these countries also are largely rivals of Iran. And as a result, Israel and the United States cooperate with them. The regional situation does tend to have a large influence on Hamas. So when the Muslim Brotherhood came to power in Egypt briefly for 2 years, in 2011, 2013, that was a very, very big boost to Hamas. The Muslim Brotherhood very much eased the crossing of Rafiah between Gaza and Egypt. It released a lot of Hamas prisoners because ideologically, even though the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt kept the peace treaty with Israel, ideologically, they saw themselves as aiding and assisting their sister organization. In turn, when the civil war broke out in Syria, Iran backed the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime is largely made up of Alawites, which are a subset of Shiite Muslims, and Hamas sided with the rebels, who were largely made up of Sunni Muslims. This led to a massive schism between Hamas and Iran. The Hamas leadership that had historically always sat in Syria was kicked out of Syria, tried to move to Lebanon, was kicked out of Lebanon, moved to Qatar, eventually with pressure was kicked out of Qatar. And Hamas was in dire straits. One of the reasons that likely led to the 2017 policy platform was this attempt to shake things up, because Iran, Syria, Saudi Arabia largely jumped ship from any support to Hamas. So regional politics and shifts do have a large influence on how Hamas operates. What is the way to stop these countries from aiding and funding Hamas? I don't think our leadership knows, so I certainly don't know. There are different theories that sanctions on Iran and Syria will eventually convince it to stop wasting money, quote unquote, on funding Hamas. This is largely shown to be ineffective. But in turn, political pressure applied on different countries, like Turkey, that has largely backed Hamas, but over the years, when there has been political pressure from the United States or Israel, has very often stopped that backing, or countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, et cetera, do tend to have a large effect. So I don't really know what is the way to stop that. If I did, I would not run for politics, but I would write to our politicians. But I will say that political pressure and regional changes do have a big effect on the Hamas movement.
All right. We're always trying to keep our events to, as close to 1 hour as possible. So maybe if you allow me to ask one more question, kind of dragging you into contemporary Israeli politics. And for a long period that you described, Netanyahu was the prime minister. But of course, now there has been a change. And in previous years, right, one of the outspoken critics who would accuse Netanyahu of not going far enough with Israeli military operations in Gaza and stopping Hamas from attacking Israel and so on, was Naftali Bennett, who now is the prime minister. So do you see continuity or potential for change in the Israeli approach, Israeli government's approach to dealing with Hamas and with the situation in Gaza?
It's an excellent question. It's hard for me to give an accurate prediction. I'll say this: you're absolutely right that in the past, people who have not sat in the prime minister's chair have had lots of ideas on how, if they were only there, then they could solve the problem in a second. Avigdor Lieberman famously said, when he becomes Minister of Defense, the leaders of Hamas will be assassinated within 48 hours. He was made Minister of Defense. That did not happen. Naftali Bennett was also Minister of Defense. That did not happen. One of the things that Naftali Bennett and his party have heavily championed is that any terror attack being launched from Gaza should be met with a retaliation, just like if it was a large-scale or small-scale attack. So one of the tactics that often happen in Gaza is sending what is called detonation balloons. Simply a couple of balloons tied together with a detonating device sent over towards the Israeli side that land sometimes in open fields, sometimes in a school. Bennett has famously said the response to a balloon like that will be the same thing as if Hamas had launched an all-out missile attack. That has largely happened. Israel has retaliated, much to some people's surprise, much more harshly to any type of violation or attack coming from Gaza since the Taliban came into power. At the same time, Israel also started doing something that has not happened since 2008, which is began talks, even just preliminary and unofficial, with the Palestinian Authority. The last round of negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, or the PLO, occurred in Annapolis in 2007, 2008. And since then, the official government policy has been they're not talking to the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is just as bad as Hamas. The PLO has betrayed us in the past. We will never talk to them. The new government, all of a sudden, ministers primarily from the left side of the map, but not only. Benny Gantz, Minister of Defense, and some might consider him left, some might consider him right, but he's certainly not a representative of the left side, has also engaged in contact and communication with the Palestinian Authority. Those things are potential for change. They're potential for change, not necessarily in negotiating with Hamas, but possibly coming up with some sort of new way of configuring the political map and suggesting that the stalemate whereby this is a situation, Hamas is there, and every now and then there's a flare-up of violence and there's nothing to do, and we continue trying to actually change it. I'm not sure how, possibly doing a deal with the PLO for the West Bank and leaving Gaza out of it, possibly making a deal with the PLO to bring the PLO back, possibly something else, but there's definitely indication that there is an attempt to change the current status quo. But I will say I'm not sure in what direction.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Not being sure in which direction, that is a good way to end this conversation. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and apologies to all those who put questions into the chat that we didn't get to today. All the more reason to join us again for future events. Alon Burstein is going to be here for a while. He's teaching this year and next year at UCI, and we will have more events featuring him, and he will explain more to us, and hopefully our next event, so we'll keep you posted. Our next event will be in person, which should be very exciting.
Hopefully. I would like to say, Matthias, because this talk is going to be on YouTube, I'm not going to repeat it again, but my email appeared at the beginning of the PowerPoint. It's alon.burstein@uci.edu. So if there are questions that people had that I didn't get to, feel free to email me. Like I said, unfortunately, I never get tired of this topic. So if anyone has follow-up questions or would like to continue discussing, by all means.
Okay, thank you very much. That is very generous. So again, thank you to everyone for joining us. Happy Thanksgiving break, and to be continued. Thank you, Alon. Thank you for this very informative talk.
Thank you, Matthias, for having me.
Thank you very much.